Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jane Ohlmeyer, and I'm the director of the Trinity Longroom Hub. Great pleasure to welcome everyone this afternoon to our Fellow in Focus, obviously a virtual discussion. I wish that we were in our beautiful building, but sadly, because of the ongoing lockdown, we're doing this virtually. And I just want to say a few words about the Hub. It's our research institute in the arts and humanities, and it's an amazing physical space. But of course, what really makes the Hub are the people in the programs in the building. We do three things. We celebrate the excellence of the arts and humanities at Trinity. We promote conversations across disciplines. And the third thing we do is public humanities. And actually, the coronavirus crisis has given us this very interesting opportunity to do stuff virtually, and we're probably reaching more audiences now than we do when we're actually in the building, and especially for our Fellows in Focus. So the Visiting Research Fellows are a hugely important part of the Trinity community, and over the years we've had hundreds of fellows from about 40 different countries. The programme has been obviously slightly stymied by the current circumstances, but I'm delighted that Kristina Varade from CUNY has stayed on in Dublin, where she's living in lockdown like the rest of us. And we're going to hear in a moment from Kristina and her research. But the Fellow in Focus is going to be, the conversation is going to be led by the Deputy Director of the Trinity Longroom Hub and our great friend and colleague, Professor Eve Patton from the School of English. And it's certainly been my privilege to be working very closely with Eve over the past year as Deputy Director. But the School of English is one of, I suppose, one of the Hub's core schools, and we've had phenomenal interactions with your school, Eve, and it gives me great pleasure to invite you to have this Fellow in Focus conversation with Kristina. And the format, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, is pretty straightforward. There'll be about a 20-25 minute conversation between Eve and Kristina, and then it'll be over to everybody in the Zoom room for questions, for observations, but because of the limitations of Zoom, it'll be Eve who asks your questions to Kristina, and then we'll aim to wrap up before 3 o'clock. So anyway, without further ado, welcome Kristina. It's fabulous to have you with us in the Hub, albeit virtually, and Eve, thank you very much for agreeing to host this in conversation. So thank you, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jane. And everyone who's listening, and good afternoon to who's going to be the Fellow in Focus for today. Kristina currently teaches at the City University of New York, and she's here, as Jane mentioned, in conjunction with the School of English. And indeed, she's got a number of very close connections to the School of English, not least in my own area, because the reason I got to know Kristina was partly through her interest in the 19th century and Irish culture in the 19th century. She's here and she's going to tell us a bit more in a minute about to work on the papers, among other things, the papers of the 19th century writer, journalist, editor, and some might say all-round scoundrel, Charles Lever. But she's putting Lever, I think, very interestingly into the context of something we're really thinking a great deal about at the moment, which is the Irish connection to continental Europe, to that great landmass of Europe that I think means so much to understanding Irish relations with the continent, and particularly in the 19th century, which sometimes I think is a little bit overlooked. I'm going to talk to Kristina about the subject that she's researching at the moment, but also about a number of her other interests, because she characterizes a scholar who works very specifically from an interdisciplinary perspective, and she draws into play culture, language, several languages, history, and, as we're going to hear a little bit about, I hope, the world of dance as well. So Kristina, I'm going to come to you first to ask you a little bit about your current research. What is it you're working on here in the Hub?
Okay, Well, thank you. I'd like to thank you, Dr. Patton and Dr. Ohlmeyer, for having me here today. Currently, I have proposed a project looking at the Irlandiani, or the Italians who have moved to Ireland in the 19th century, as part of the project. And then, of course, the other part of the project working on Charles Lever and his time in Italy. And so I guess I'll just start by talking a little bit about Charles Lever and the monograph there. I became fascinated with Lever when I was working a little bit on Lady Morgan. She had been working about Italy, writing about Italy. But I just kind of felt like there would be more than some of the observations that she had. And so I started to look for a writer, specifically an Irish writer, that would spend time in Italy. And fortunately, I stumbled upon the works of Charles Lever, who was a contemporary of Charles Dickens. Very popular initially in his career, and then kind of fell out of favor as he spent time as a consular representative in Italy. And there's a very famous quotation about Lever from Chris Marash that says, "He was too Irish for an English canon and too English for an Irish canon. And as such, he's now floundering in the Irish Sea." And that's where he's been ever since. And so I wanted to resurrect his work and to look more deeply into it, because I feel that there's a lot that can be said about being cosmopolitan. You know, he was in Trieste and in Italy at a time, a generation before Joyce, which a lot of people don't realize. And I just would like to know why these people were drawn to Italy. Why did he stay so long? What was his experience there? Working with the rare manuscripts at Trinity, I've been able to shed some light on those reasons. But also looking at his personal letters has been extremely rewarding in trying to approach this project.
And tell me a little bit more about the kind of genre that you're working on with Lever. I know you're looking at correspondence, but in a way, we often think of him in that very contemporary category of popular literature. And Dickens, of course, very much his contemporary, now safely in the rank of the highbrow. Are you having to negotiate, I suppose, a certain degree of prejudice with regard to the very popular mode in which writers like Lever were, of course, making a lot of money?
Right. You know, he was very, very prolific. And initially, these were made in serials and in journals like the Dublin University magazine. And so trying to sift through all of the material has been quite difficult. Reading through all the novels as well. He's a problematic writer because he forgets who his characters are, and he loses track of his thought. I mean, these are all human qualities, but some other writers, I think, were forgiven for that, whereas he might not necessarily have been.
Yes.
And also what's particularly interesting thinking about the letters and the correspondence is that he shows expressions and emotions that would have been unusual for a Victorian male of his class at the time. So that's been very interesting to work through. Also, the letters specifically that are addressed to his wife and his daughters, they had a very important place in his life. So we don't really see that with many Victorian writers at the time.
Yeah, indeed. And I know it's been tremendously valuable to have you here, really, as one of our pioneer researchers to go into the archives and to really make use of what Trinity, of course, has in the wonderful collections. But I just want to pick up on something you talked about, which is the difficulty, and I think a number of our listeners or panel or contributors today might share this, the difficulty of working on writers, on artists who don't fall neatly inside national boundaries. And I know that this is something you have looked at in terms of contemporary fiction in particular, the question of what globalization has provided as a kind of new identity, I suppose, for writers who've really pushed away the boundaries of what we used to think about as the safety of the nation state. Do they always lose out in the end because they don't fit into a neatly defined category of Irishness, of Italianness?
You know, I don't like to be very negative about that kind of perspective, but I do see that there are a lot of tensions. And fragmentation. I have approached a lot of this material, especially the contemporary Irish and Italian material, from a postmodern perspective, and looking at it at that way. I do see a lot of problematic perceptions of trying to fit neatly in any kind of box. Now, I think that it's wonderful that they don't, and that they challenge themselves not to necessarily fit in those boxes. But even as we work in an interdisciplinary way, we're kind of doing the same thing, right? We are not putting ourselves in one subject or another, but we're trying to approach things, in the not neat kind of a way. It just makes for richer reading, I've found. And even given those, the problems that come with it, there is a lot of material that also reflects in similar ways. So, for example, with some of the current research that I've been doing with the novels, the Irish and the Italian novels, finding topics like the use of technology, how that either says something about identity, or the use of consumer products. What does that say about identity? And so even though there's a lot of overlap between different things, there are some topics, especially in this day and age, that seem to be repeating.
Exactly.
Across boundaries.
Exactly. And it strikes me that, you're facing a similar concern to many of us. The great critic Linda Hutcheon have said, we're not really ready to let go of the concept of a national canon yet, even though we know we should. And I suppose many of us don't really want to let go of disciplinary boundaries, even though we know that so many things push in that direction. So there are sacrifices on both sides. But I want to come on to ask you a little bit about this very exciting research that you've been doing on contemporary fiction, both Irish and Italian. In terms of technology, you're looking at everything, I think, from mobile phone usage as it's represented in fiction to various other forms of technological communication that come into play. And I think many of us are gearing up to see the television adaptation of Sally Rooney's novel, Trinity set novel, Normal People, next week. And of course, this is one of a number of new novels that very heavily relies on email and text communications as part of its narrative. So I just wonder, what is it that is, you think you can tell us about it?
So the most recent work that I've done on cell phone and technology has been more focused on the Italian, and it was worked on in a volume on the post-human. But what's very interesting is that we see this also in Irish literature, in Irish contemporary literature as well. And there has been a tradition of it. So for the Italian side, we're looking at writers like Aldo Nove, Giuseppe Colicchia, Andrea De Carlo. They were some of the first to really put down the importance of the cell phone and of text messaging in these novels very, very quite early on, showing the fragmentation of the individual that happens, and how an identity and a sense of self can be determined through these means. We have that also regularly now, as you said, in Sally Rooney's work, and in other Irish writers as well. But another thing I've been thinking about is, and another part of the project that I'll be working on, is looking at, cinematic representations of things like monuments and the wanderer in the city. And specifically, I'll be looking at that with Joyce and an Italian cinema movie called The Perfect Beauty, La Grande Bellezza, The Great Beauty. So looking at how these things, not necessarily that they are coming from us right in the center, which of course they are, but also how they have been developing throughout time.
Yes, and it's a growing field of study, isn't it? That we look to the novel no longer for the idea of finding morals and values, but simply to see or to try to untangle how it is we now communicate with each other. And very often this is, I suppose, illuminated most visibly and perhaps prior to anything else in narrative. I think it's a fascinating field. But I would just want to before we move to questions, to ask you about another area which came up when we first met quite by accident as one of your passions and interests. which is dance. And you are yourself an Irish dancer, I think at quite a high level, um, uh, with a lot of experience in this field. And one of the things that you've done in New York is to participate and to help organize a number of events which look at the culture of Irish dance. Now, this is of huge interest to us, particularly at the moment when I think we're seeing a number of ventures in the arts world which are using dance in a much closer relation, for example, to literature. I'm thinking of something like the wonderful recent ballet of Woolf works, the balletization, if you like, of Virginia Woolf's novels, which was such an extraordinary event a couple of years ago. What is it that you think dance, and Irish dance in particular, can tell us at the moment that we might not see in other art forms?
I was very surprised that this area of inquiry that I dove into became such a big and important part of our society today. And it was just kind of a fluke. I didn't really expect it to happen. And I think this is a good lesson for anyone who's interested in writing about their passions, because you never know what it's going to lead to. And yes, I was an Irish dancer. I started really late. I was about 15. I was of the river dance generation. So when they came to New York, I was smitten, and then I started classes and got into it really, really quickly. But I always felt that there was more there than that was being addressed with just competition and just with music. And so, I started to look at the literature about writing. I think Elish Negrovna wrote about the Irish dancing, and then there were other examples, and I wanted to do something with it. So in my particular case, I was looking at costuming and the ways that costuming was changing with globalization, because there's a marked change between what Irish dance costuming was before and after the turn of the millennium. Of course, the internet has a lot to do with that, popularity of Irish dance across the world. But it was able to help me look at dance from a more academic kind of point of view. Now, of course, dance has had, you've had practice-based research, you've had ethno-choreological research, but I wanted to bring that more into Irish studies. And so with Dr. Brendan DeGale and with Dr. Dara Carr, two dancers and professors in Ireland and in New York, we decided to have a conference at NYU. And we brought 4 different departments of NYU together, and it was a big international conference. And at that one, we had things like the Casement Project was presented, and Anya Stapleton's Medicated Milk, which is about Lucia Joyce. So we're really seeing the beginning of the way dance can be looked at in a more academic way, and through venues like the Long Room Hub to be able to bring that into, more into the university.
Indeed, and I think that this is something a number of my colleagues already are beginning to research, but very much through literary history, through looking at Yeats and dance, for example. So it's great to have you bring this up into the contemporary moment. And I really hope this is something that we can come back to and do more with you as our expert consultant. I know for participants that the online piece that Kristina wrote on this subject has had a huge number of hits already, and it might be you can share that with anyone who's interested after the session. I think we might move and take a couple of questions at this point, Kristina, and I have a question from Sarah O'Brien. Hello to you, Sarah. I'm interested in Kristina's reference to the emotional repression of Victorian men.
Right, so...
Why does she think Charles was more open to emotional expression? Was it? Yep. I think she's linked that to the question of European modes of social interaction. So you might have a think about that. Right.
Yes, of course. Clearly being away from the center, as Lever was, Ireland was his home, and he left it in a way was away from it for most of his life. He would have had a lot of exposure to the people of Italy, and that's one of the reasons why I love his work. Of course, there are some stereotypes that we will see in this kind of writing, but I really felt like he gets to know or wants to know more of the local people that are surrounding him. So yeah, I think even being away from that center, that Irish center, maybe he feels freer to express some of these, his anxieties and or not negotiating through questions of identity. I do think it fostered that in him.
Indeed, and I suppose, you're talking about a time when there perhaps wasn't that sense of distinction between Ireland and Europe that we take for granted in a way today, particularly in the circuits of diplomacy, for example, of travel for government, of high-level tourism even, and of course even of religious travel, religious-related travel that links Ireland and Italy very closely in the period. I'm going to go to a second question from Carmen San Julian, which is about research done by Kirkman, Tarras and Steele, which shows, she reports, that the biggest cultural gaps are within countries, not between them. And obviously we still are seeing the rise of nationalism around the world. When do you think we're going to move on from this question and learn our identity is multiple and complex? I think such a relevant question there from Carmen in terms of the work that you're doing on Lever, but also on the novel.
Exactly. I mean, this is the way we have to move forward to overcome these sort of turns inside. We have seen a turn, more insular kind of a turn in this day and age. And I think looking at works like Lever's and not trying to simplify them and not trying to come to conclusions that we really can't come to because he didn't come to them are important. It's not nice for us as humans not to have a perfect whole or a sense of completeness. It's uncomfortable. But that is our reality. And so the sooner we're able to realize that and look at what makes us better when we're in multiple is going to be the way to move forward, I believe. And I think the literature here, either the older, the 19th century, that's hard or difficult to work with, or 21st century that is comfortable in expressing those kinds of anxieties. It will help us to understand ourselves a bit better.
Thank you. I have a question from Margaret Carson, who is one of your colleagues at CUNY. Can you say a little bit more about the Irlandiani? I think I've pronounced that correctly. And she's asking about migration of Italians to Ireland. What led them to come to Ireland? And at the same time, of course, we think of Irish more traditionally migrating to the US and elsewhere. So what about this very distinct connection between Italian and the Italians in Ireland? And it's something we know about a little bit through looking again at Joyce and a cultural perspective. But if you could enlarge on that very interesting question from Margaret.
Yes, so this was going to be the second part of the project at the Hub, and then to be continued in other fellowships, one being at Marshall's Library as well in Dublin. But I always felt that people really haven't looked at the writing of the earlier Italians that moved to Ireland. And so, you're struck by Joyce. You have the fish and chip sellers, and you have the gelatai, the gelato sellers, and then you have the stuccadores, which is a term for the stucco makers that came to work on the big houses. These are the kinds of narratives that I really would like to know to start, at least to begin. Irlandiani is a term that some Italians embrace to call themselves, the Italians that live in Ireland. And today there's a very vibrant community. There's Radio Dublino, and then there's, of course, anything that's happening with the consulate. Many Italians with a vibrant history here. And those are the kinds of things that I'd like to look at in their written documentation.
Yeah, it's an absolutely fascinating topic. And I know even from the changes in the Second World War period, for example, where Italians, of course, were very often contained and held in confinement for that period, itself is a very interesting product of this in relation to British culture and the Irish situation, and what happened at that point is fascinating. But to stay with the question of Italy just for a minute, Emily Bloom, who of course was with us in the hub not very long ago. Hello, Emily. Is asking a little bit more about the Italian novels that feature mobile phones. When did they start to appear, and what happens to the body in novels where you're focusing on texting and mobile interactions? Would you call this, and I'm using Emily's term here, disembodied aesthetic?
I would absolutely say it's approaching a disembodied aesthetic. This book chapter will be coming out this summer in a volume on the posthuman, and I can forward along that information. But it started really, I think, with Aldo Nove's work. He had this short story Vibravo, and it's a little bit vulgar, but the cell phone provides a false sense of sexual emancipation and gender power to the woman narrator. The woman asks her husband for a cell phone, and she has it physically put into her body. And so, because she's so attached to it, it's such a part of her. So, you know, we talk about AI and about people putting chips in to live longer. He was doing this, writing this, and envisioning this already in the 80s. So other writers, Andrea De Carlo, for example, will put, and that was around 2000, wrote some books where it was just all text message and email written on the page. So very interesting when texting started to become very popular. And we forget, but this is all relatively recent in the grand scheme of things. And it seems like it's been a part of us for so long. So it's nice to look at when these things started to happen. And that's what was interesting for me with the Italian
And
novel.
if I can piggyback on that, I mean, this is something that we're very with if we look at the genre of the novel and its deep roots in an epistolary tradition, in letter writing. So I suppose in many ways, this shouldn't be an alien evolution for us. It's more a natural progression in communication, perhaps. But let me very quick questions, and one is from Deborah Michlewitz. I hope I pronounced that correctly for Deborah, and it's about the divide between Irish and English literature. Now, this is obviously a huge topic, but it's a problem that you must encounter a lot in your work, and particularly when you're teaching outside Ireland, in New York, for example, and trying to explain that boundary, if it can still be explained in any kind of concrete way.
I really try to avoid creating these kinds of boundaries between, everything, just because it became so complicated, especially when you think of it from Lever's point of view. He calls himself British, he calls himself Irish. It depends on the situation. It's always in flux, and I feel it's just questioning the canons again, and that's what we are here for. We really should be making those questions. So I would tend to try to avoid, putting things into the categories if I can. Even just thinking about Lever himself, because he is Anglo-Irish, but he's also Irish and he's also English. So it becomes very hard.
I suppose in a way it could be a productive conflict for writers such as Lever, that they can, bounce off the kind of ambiguity that might surround them. And we know, of course, that Wilde did this. We know that Shaw did this. It's something that, mobilizes writers as much as restricts them. But it perhaps leads into what will probably be the final question we can fit in, which is from Mary Hatfield. And Mary's asking about your idea of cosmopolitanism. How does this inform your work on Irish dancing and costume in particular? Is Irish dance a manifestation of cosmopolitanism? And I think that's a fascinating question, because the cosmopolitan is sometimes a negative term in cultural discourse. Certainly it was again, to go back to the Irish revival, it was very much seen as something you did not aspire to. How can you address the idea of the cosmopolitan when you're looking at something as nationally specific as Irish dance traditions?
Irish dance has come so far now from what it was as a traditional dance. Of course, if you know the difference between sean-nós dancing and for example, competition dancing, sean-nós tries to stay very close to what it was. It really holds on to its roots without a lot of change. I would say it's closer to a national Irish dance than what we are seeing now with, competition style dancing, which is what I was primarily involved in, and also with river dance. Yes, of course, we also have the class issues that go, and economics, especially the costumes now cost 3,000, 4,000 euro, and they have to change them all the time because the children grow and, styles come and go. So that adds another element. And if this is cosmopolitanism as well, an example of it, it's definitely not necessarily a positive one. However, on the other hand, it is opening up the world to people that would never have experienced this particular aspect of Irish culture before, even in its problematic term as Irish, but it has opened up the world to learning a little bit more about what Ireland is.
And I suppose it tells us a lot about that particular quality of an Irish diaspora. Early 20th century, an English folk dance tradition would have been just as strong in many regards and just as pervasive within England itself. But of course, nobody in the US is running English folk dancing competitions, at least to the best of my knowledge. But that sense of what was carried through a diaspora is incredibly special, I think, and perhaps a way of mitigating the sometimes negative aspects of cosmopolitanism itself. But we can talk about this for a long time, I imagine, Kristina. It's an absolutely fascinating topic, as are the various things that you've talked to us today about. I want to thank the people who sent in questions for being just so precise, but so to the point with their questions. And I know that Kristina will be able to answer them in greater detail in her many forthcoming publications. But Kristina, thank you so much for talking to me today. I'm going to wrap up the Fellow in Focus session now and hand back to the director, to Jane Ohlmeyer, who's going to add a few words and perhaps tell us about forthcoming events. But Kristina, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eve. Thank you very much, Kristina, for that absolutely fascinating conversation. It's funny, Jean Butler, as you know from Riverdance, was in the hub recently, and I was trying to figure out how you guys knew each other so well, and now I understand. And we're really excited about doing more collaboration actually with Jean, and she's got a fabulous project on the history of dance. Anyway, that's for the future, Kristina, and so hopefully we'll have you back in the hub when we have that conversation as well. So before we thank you and Eve, just a few announcements, colleagues. First is we'll have another Fellow in Focus on the 30th of April, and that will be at 1 o'clock, and it'll be with our former fellow, Pramesh Lalu. So Pramesh was with us this time last year for, oh my goodness, 3 months. It went very, very quickly. He's now back in Cape Town at the University of Western Cape, and he's going to talk a little bit about just what life is like in South Africa under lockdown, and particularly what the arts and humanities have to bring to the conversations in South Africa. So I'm hoping everybody will be able to join us for that Fellow in Focus with Pramesh Lalu, which is on the 30th at 1 o'clock, so different time. And again, you'll get notices through our weekly newsletter, or it's on the website. The other thing I just want to give a bit of a plug to is we have been running our Behind the Headlines. I think we've done 2 already. We're doing a 3rd one on Monday, which is called Rethinking Democracy in a Time of Pandemic. We've got a fabulous lineup on Monday evening. It'll be at 7:30. We've got Peter Baldwin, the historian from UCLA. We have Ahuvia Kane, who is a classicist here in Trinity. We have Lilith Acadia, who is a literary scholar and who is one of our co-fund visiting research fellows. So she's from the community here in the hub. And then last but not least, we've got Seamus Khan, Professor Seamus Khan, who's a sociologist at Columbia University. So that's at 7:30 on Monday night. But actually, we're doing that Behind the Headlines to usher in a 5-week long seminar series that we're running on rethinking democracy in an age of pandemic. It will be an invited only workshop, but if people are interested, please contact us. But we are hoping to live stream as well, so we'll be sending you more information about that. So check our website, sign up for our newsletter. Everybody's extremely welcome. And I just really want to finish now by thanking everybody who makes these events possible, especially the team in the Trinity Long Room Hub, Francesca, Aoife, and Katrina. Doing things virtually has taken us a little bit to get our heads around, but it's starting, I think, to work very effectively. So obviously a lot of hard work in the background. I'd love to thank you, Eve, for being such a fantastic conversationalist. Everybody who has submitted questions, clearly there were more questions, this conversation could go on, but it's always good to leave the table feeling a little bit hungry, and people can of course follow up with Kristina via email. And again, really looking forward to reading your publications as they come out, Kristina. And if we could, in our customary way, simply thank Kristina for a fabulous So thank you, and stay well, everybody, and look forward to seeing you next time at the Trinity Long Room Hub. So bye, and thank you.